Well, friends, while the people are leaving the big tent tonight, I'd like to say it has been a tremendous personal thrill to me to preach the gospel to the people and pray for their
I'm
sins.
Cathy Logan. I'm now the editor of Scene and Spot magazine, but I started with the Tulsa World in '78, and it wasn't long after that that I became the higher education writer, and that's when I first started writing about Oral Roberts, and I first met him. The issue at hand was the accreditation of his law school, and he was battling with the American Bar Association because they said, "We will not accredit your law school because you make all of the students sign a pledge saying that Jesus is your personal Savior and that you believe in Him solely." And they said, you know, that's discriminatory to people of other faiths. And there had been a lawsuit that had been filed, and there were all these motions that were being heard. And then the Bar Association had their convention in New Orleans, and Oral went himself. And when he went down there, he just charmed them. He just absolutely blew all this group of this most prestigious attorneys and judges in the country away. And he talked to them and about his personal beliefs and about the beliefs of the people that were already involved with the law school, and he got his accreditation. I had been writing about this in the lead up to his meeting in New Orleans, and shortly after he came back, I got a call from his longtime secretary, Ruth Rooks, and she asked me to come out and visit with Oral. And I went there to the Learning Resources Center, which his office was up on the top floor. They jokingly called it Seventh Heaven on the campus. And she seated me in his office, which was, you know, very nice, very lavish with an expansive view. And I waited and waited for probably 15 minutes before he came in. And he stalked into the room, and he had a very serious look on his face. And he kind of stood over me where I was seated. And he said, "I want to ask you, first of all, are you a Christian?" And I looked up at him and I said, "Well, President Roberts, I think of myself as a Christian, but you probably wouldn't. You probably, by your understanding and your principles, you wouldn't consider me a Christian." And he laughed a little bit, and then he sat down and he said, "You know, I always ask people that. That's the first thing I always ask people when I figure it's going to be a hard discussion." And he said, "They always start defending themselves. You're the first one who ever said that you probably weren't, as according to my beliefs." And then he asked me if I was part Indian, and we talked about that a little bit. I confirmed that I was, and we talked about that a little bit, and we just hit it off. He was terribly charming. I watched him go into groups of people, and sometimes I'll never forget a social function, and there were all sorts of very wealthy people, and some come from all over the country that were here for a petroleum meeting, and he was supposed to be one of the speakers, and they were all kind of laughing about meeting Oral Roberts until he walked into the room. And before it was all over, they were all asking to have their photographs taken with him, and not a few of them gave him checks before he left that social event. And it was intriguing. Our talks and conversations over the years, of course it would normally be some big news event that would cause me to go out there. So, although sometimes he called me and would, you know, it would be totally by surprise. But one of the most difficult, I think, was a couple of years after Richard and his son Richard Roberts, who succeeded him as the president of the university, he and his wife lost their first child. And it was a little boy, and he lived for a couple of days and then died, despite all that the doctors could do. And Oral was talking about, at the time, the topic that was really taking up all of his attention were these medical missions trips to Africa that he was trying to set up. And he was talking about how difficult it had been to get his prayer partners, those people who watched his broadcast and who sent him money and helped to finance the different programs that he had, how difficult it was to explain to them that all healing came from God, whether it was healing at the hands of doctors or from ministers like he was, who would lay their hands on someone and do healing. And I asked him some questions about that. And I said something about because he was talking about evangelists and how Jesus had set out different roles for his followers, that everyone had a different kind of function, and that he was an evangelist and a healer. And that in God's very first conversation with him, direct conversation with him, told him that that was his charge, that he was to go out and spread God's healing powers to his generation. And I said, you know, it's interesting because you certainly have laid your hands on more people than any of Jesus's disciples. And he sat back and he thought a minute and he said, I tell you now that no man has ever failed as much as Oral Roberts. He said, I've tried and tried and tried. And he said, and sometimes there's great success. And I have many, many people who will testify that I have healed them. And he said, of course, all healing comes from God. And he said, but I also tell you that I have failed more times than I've succeeded. And so I asked him about, because I knew that when Richard and Lindsay's son was born, that they called Oral and he flew in so that he could lay hands on his grandson. And he said, I never tried harder. I never prayed more. I never felt so filled with a passion for healing. And he died anyway. And he said, that'll be my first question that I ask God when I die. I'll ask him why I failed.